The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded 3 times and sealed with plain wax, and the moment Raymond Garrison read the word, "Forgettable," he set his coffee cup down on the rough-hewn table of his ranch house in southeastern Colorado, stared at that single word for exactly 10 seconds, and then stood up and walked straight to the stable without even pulling on his jacket. It was the autumn of 1882, and the high plains of Colorado were already breathing their first cold warnings toward winter, the kind of air that tasted like iron and pine and something unforgiving. Raymond was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with calloused hands that had spent a decade fighting the land into something resembling a livelihood. He had a cattle operation going on 400 head now, a respectable spread southeast of Pueblo near the town of Cañon City, and a house that had 3 rooms and 2 windows and absolutely nothing warm inside it except the fireplace. He had been alone for 7 years, since his mother died and his younger brother Cal moved north to Wyoming chasing some fever dream about silver. He had not complained about the solitude, not aloud, not to anyone. But the solitude had been quietly eating at him, the way rust eats iron, slowly and invisibly, until you pressed on something and found there was nothing solid left. A preacher's wife in town, a Mrs. Dorothea Calloway, had taken it upon herself 6 months ago to write on his behalf to a woman in Missouri who had been placed by a boarding house matron with a correspondence agency. These agencies were common enough in 1882. Women in the East, or the border states, who had few prospects wrote to men in the territories who had land but no family. Raymond had not exactly agreed to the arrangement. He had been sitting in the Calloway parlor, eating the worst apple cake he had ever tasted, and Mrs. Calloway had said, "Raymond, I am going to help you," and he had said, "Mrs. Calloway, I wish you wouldn't," and she had said, "Too late, I already wrote the letter." That had been March. Now it was October, and the correspondence had been going back and forth for 6 months. Letters that Raymond read and reread alone by lamplight. Letters from a woman named Susanna Thatcher who lived in Hannibal, Missouri, who had been keeping her younger siblings fed and clothed for 3 years since her father's death by taking in sewing and helping at the local dry goods store. In her letters she was precise and careful, and a little formal in the way people get when they are working very hard not to seem desperate. She wrote about Missouri weather and the price of calico and the way the river looked in the evening. She never once complained. Raymond found this both admirable and heartbreaking. The letter he held now was not from Susanna. It was from the boarding house matron who had originally put Susanna's name into the correspondence agency, a woman named Mrs. Elvira Potts, who had apparently taken it upon herself to write directly to Raymond with what she called an honest account of the woman's qualities and limitations so that you can make a clear-headed decision. Mrs. Potts had described Susanna's practical nature, her good health, her reliable disposition, and her competent housekeeping. She had noted that Susanna was a good seamstress and not a complainer. And then in the 3rd paragraph, in plain, unadorned ink, she had written that Susanna was not what one might call handsome, being of medium height and plain features, the sort of young woman who does not draw the eye in a room, forgettable in appearance though solid in character. Forgettable. Raymond stood in the stable with that word pressing against the inside of his chest like a boot heel. He brushed his horse, a big gray quarter horse he called Dusk, with long even strokes, and did not think about it with his rational mind at all. He just felt it, the way that word sat in a letter written by a woman who barely knew Susanna Thatcher, sitting in comfortable judgment, deciding what Susanna was and was not worth, pressing that assessment into ink as though it were fact. As though a woman's whole being could be measured and found lacking before she had ever once been truly seen. He thought about the letters Susanna had written, the careful, precise handwriting. The way she had described helping her brother Thomas work out a mathematics problem by lamplight, because Thomas was bright, but the schoolteacher in Hannibal was overworked and distracted. The way she had written about a stray cat that had shown up at the boarding house in August, scrawny and suspicious, and how she had won it over in 3 days with patience and bits of dried meat. The way she had, only once, let the careful composure slip just slightly, in a letter from September when she had written, "I find that I would very much like to be somewhere that I chose rather than somewhere I ended up. I am not certain I have ever been somewhere I chose." She had crossed that last sentence out and then apparently reconsidered and let it stand, and Raymond had read that crossed-out but still visible sentence approximately 40 times. He saddled dusk by lantern light without thinking very hard about what he was doing. He wrote one note, left it on the table under the coffee cup. It said, "Gone to Missouri, back in 3 weeks, feed the cattle twice daily. R. Garrison." He had a neighboring family, the Aldriches, who helped him when he traveled, and their eldest son would see the note and know what to do. Raymond had left instructions before. He rode north to pick up the Santa Fe Trail route east, riding steady through the night, and the stars above the Colorado high plains were so dense and cold they looked carved rather than lit. The temperature dropped to something that bit at his ears and his fingers, and he did not stop. He changed horses once at a relay station outside of La Junta, spending an hour eating a bowl of beans by a fire and not speaking to anyone. And then he was back in the saddle with a fresher horse he'd rented for the next leg of the journey. He crossed into Kansas before the second dawn, and the land flattened into something vast and amber and ancient, the short grass prairie stretching in every direction like a held breath. 4 days. 4 days of riding east with only short stops to rest the horses and himself, eating whatever he could get at relay stations and trail stops, sleeping twice for a few hours in a bedroll on the open ground with the horse picketed nearby. He thought about Susanna Thatcher the whole time. Not in a dramatic or overwrought way, but persistently, steadily, the way you think about something that has gotten inside your chest and refuses to leave. He thought about that word, forgettable, and he thought about the woman who wrote letters about stray cats and her brother's arithmetic and the river at evening, and he could not make those two things fit together in the same universe. He arrived in Hannibal, Missouri on a Saturday morning in the second week of October 1882, travel-worn and dusty, and 4 days' worth of unshaved and smelling distinctly of horse and open country. Hannibal sat on the west bank of the Mississippi River and was a real and proper town by that point, with brick buildings on Main Street and a rail depot and a working waterfront. Raymond arrived looking like something the prairie had chewed on and spit out, and he tied his rented horse at the rail outside a feed store and asked the first sensible-looking person he saw, a middle-aged man carrying a bolt of wire, where the Whitmore boarding house was, because that was the address on Susanna's letters. The man gave him directions that involved 2 left turns and a right at the Methodist church, and Raymond walked there with the stiff, careful gait of a man who had been in a saddle for 4 days and was feeling it in every joint. The Whitmore boarding house was a tall, narrow wood frame building painted white, with a small front porch and window boxes that still held the dried remnants of summer flowers. Raymond stood at the gate for a moment and ran a hand through his trail-rough hair and looked down at his coat, which was decent beneath the dust, and decided there was not much he could do about the rest of it. He opened the gate and went up to the front door and knocked. A stout woman in an apron answered. She had sharp eyes and the kind of expression that suggested she had seen everything there was to see and been unimpressed by most of it. This was, he somehow knew instantly, Mrs. Elvira Potts. "I am looking for Susanna Thatcher," Raymond said. Mrs. Potts looked him up and down slowly. "And who might you be?" "Raymond Garrison, from Colorado." A pause in which Mrs. Potts' expression shifted from guarded to something he could not quite name. "She's not here," she said. "It's Saturday. She's at the dry goods store until 3. Raymond looked at the sun's position in the sky. It was about 1:30. "Where is the dry goods store, Mrs.?" Potts told him, and also told him that he looked like he had ridden from Colorado without stopping, which was perceptive of her, and that he had better clean himself up before he presented himself to a respectable young woman, which was also probably sound advice. Raymond thanked her, found a barbershop 2 streets over, paid for a shave and the use of a wash basin, beat most of the trail dust out of his coat as best he could, and walked to the dry goods store at Hannibal's main commercial street with 7 minutes to spare before 3 o'clock. He stood outside the store for a moment, looking through the large front window. The interior was well lit for a Saturday afternoon, sunlight coming through the glass in the open door, and there were 2 customers browsing near the fabric bolts and a man behind the main counter who appeared to be the proprietor. And there, near the far wall, standing on a short step stool and reaching up to replace a bolt of green wool onto a high shelf, was a young woman in a brown dress with her dark hair pinned up and a measuring tape draped over one shoulder. Raymond opened the door and went inside. He had not known exactly what he intended to say. He had ridden 4 days with a great deal of clarity about why he was riding and almost no clarity about what would happen when he arrived. He stood just inside the door of the dry goods store, and the woman on the step stool turned to look at who had come in, the way people do when a door opens, automatic and incurious, and then she saw him and went very still. She was, he thought, the most quietly striking woman he had ever seen in his life. Not in the showy way of women who knew they were beautiful and deployed it, but in the way of something real dark eyes that were intelligent and a little cautious, a face that was serious and composed but had a quality of watchfulness in it, like someone who had learned to pay careful attention to the world because the world had not always been kind. She was medium height, exactly as described, and her features were regular rather than dramatic. And Mrs. Elvira Potts had been so catastrophically wrong that Raymond felt something shift in his chest like tectonic plates. "Miss Thatcher," he said. She stepped down from the stool with a careful, measured movement, her hands clasped together in front of her. "Mr. Garrison," she said. Her voice was even, but her eyes were doing something much more complicated. You are here." "I am," he said. A beat of silence in which the 2 customers near the fabric bolts had gone absolutely still, and the proprietor behind the counter was pretending very hard to be busy with something. "Mrs. Potts sent me a letter," Raymond said, because he felt he owed her that honesty. Something moved across Susanna's face, a quick tightening, a controlled thing that she managed almost immediately. "I see," she said. "I read it once," he said, "and then I saddled my horse and rode here. I want you to know that before anything else." The controlled expression faltered. I beg your pardon. She used a word I didn't like," he said. "A word that didn't match the person I'd been reading letters from for 6 months. I thought it wanted some correcting." Susanna Thatcher looked at him for a long moment with those careful, intelligent eyes. The 2 customers near the fabric bolts had given up entirely on pretending not to listen. "You rode from Colorado," she said slowly, "because of a word." "Because of you," Raymond said, and he was not a man given to dramatic statements, which made this one land exactly as hard as it should have. Susanna's composure held, but just barely. She looked away toward the window for a moment, looking at the street outside and the October light coming through the glass, and when she looked back her eyes were very bright. "I need to finish my shift," she said. "I get off at 3. Will you wait?" "I waited 6 months," he said. "I can wait 30 minutes." He sat on the bench outside the store. The October air off the Mississippi was different from Colorado air, heavier, softer, smelling of water and river mud and something vegetal and alive. He watched the street traffic go by, the wagons and the pedestrians and the occasional man on horseback, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular quality of anticipation that isn't anxious but is simply full, like a held breath before something good. At 3 o'clock exactly, Susanna Thatcher came out of the store wearing a gray wool coat over her brown dress, her hair still pinned up under a plain bonnet, carrying a small basket over one arm. She stopped in front of the bench and looked at him. "There is a park 2 streets over along the river," she said, "if you would like to walk." "I would like that very much," he said, and stood. They walked side by side along streets that smelled of the Mississippi, through neighborhoods of modest wood frame houses, to a riverside park where large cottonwood trees had gone gold in the October air, and the river lay flat and enormous to the east, wide and gray-brown and quietly magnificent. They sat on a wooden bench near the water, and Susanna set her basket down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the river. "Mrs. Potts means well," she said finally. "She has been kind to me in the ways she knows how to be kind. I don't think she intended harm." "That's generous of you," Raymond said. "It's honest of me," Susanna said. "I've thought about what she probably wrote. She's practical. She assesses things practically. She would have thought she was doing you a service by setting accurate expectations." A short pause. "I am not vain about my looks, Mr. Garrison. I have never had cause to be, but I will say that it is a particular kind of hurt to know that someone sat down and decided to warn a man about you." Raymond looked at the river. "I'd like to tell you what I thought," he said, "when I read it." "All right." "I thought that she had described a woman she had never bothered to read." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture. Susanna sat very still beside him. The cottonwood leaves moved in the river wind. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "you rode 4 days." "I did." "You must be exhausted." "Bone tired," he agreed. Then why she stopped, started again. Why not simply write a letter? Why not ask me to come to Colorado as originally discussed and meet there in the reasonable way? Raymond considered the question seriously, because it was a serious question. "Because," he said, "the minute I read that word, I had the very strong sense that someone needed to be standing in front of you rather than writing to you from a distance. Letters are good, but sometimes a thing needs to be said face to face." He paused. "Also, I was angry, and writing is a good use of anger." Susanna looked at him then, really looked at him, and he looked back, and the Mississippi moved past them enormous and indifferent, and the cottonwood leaves came loose in 2s and 3s and drifted down around them. "I have spent 3 years being practical," Susanna said quietly. "After my father died, Thomas was 12 and Clara was 9, and the money was gone, and there was nothing for it but to be practical. I am good at being practical. I am so very tired of being practical." "You don't have to be," Raymond said. "Not every minute. You don't know me." "No, but I've been learning you for 6 months, and what I've learned tells me you could afford to rest the practicality now and then." A small sound escaped her that was almost a laugh and not quite, something warmer and more surprised than a laugh. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked at the river, and the almost laugh became something real, soft and quiet, and Raymond felt it in his sternum. "Tell me about Colorado," she said. "Tell me about the ranch. Tell me what it looks like." So he told her. He told her about the high plains east of the Rockies, the way the mountains stood along the western horizon like something invented rather than real, too large and too permanent, and too white-capped to believe. He told her about the cattle, the particular rhythm of ranch work, the cold springs and the hot, dry summers, and the falls that were the color of everything beautiful at once. He told her about the house, honestly, without embellishment, 3 rooms and 2 windows and a fireplace, and the particular kind of quiet that a house has when only one person lives in it. He told her about his neighbor Aldrich and his family, the 6 children who treated Raymond's land as a secondary playground, and about the town of Canyon City with its limestone canyons and its apple orchards, and the Arkansas River running through it cold and clear. Susanna listened the way she did everything with complete, careful attention. She asked questions that were precise and thoughtful. How many acres? What kind of pasture? How did the cattle do in the winter? Was the well reliable? He answered all of them straight, and she nodded and filed them away, and he could see her building the picture in her mind with the same methodical thoroughness she probably brought to everything. "My brother Thomas is 17 now," she said when he finished. "Clara is 14. I have been hoping that if I were to marry, I might be able to arrange for them to come west as well. Thomas especially. He is bright, and there is nothing for a bright boy in Hannibal right now who has no money and no connections. He'd work hard." "My operation could use a hand who would work hard," Raymond said. Susanna looked at him. "You have not even decided yet whether you want to marry me." I have actually, Raymond said. I decided about 100 miles into Kansas. The river slipped past. A steamboat appeared around the northern bend, moving slowly south, its smoke rising white against the October blue sky. Mr. Garrison, Susanna said carefully. Raymond, he said, please. Raymond, she said, and something in the way she said his name, testing it, finding the shape of it, made his chest do something involuntary. I will not pretend I have not thought about this, about you, about what going to Colorado might mean. I have thought about very little else since your first letter arrived. She paused. But I need you to understand that I am not the kind of woman who wants to be rescued. I have no patience for that. I have been managing 3 people's lives for 3 years, and I have done it adequately. And if I marry you, it will be because I want to build something with you, not because you have come in from the West to solve my problems. I didn't come to solve your problems, Raymond said. I came because of a word in a letter that wasn't true, and because I am 31 and tired and my house has no warmth in it except the fireplace, and I have been reading your letters for 6 months and thinking that anyone who writes the way you write deserves to be seen properly. Susanna was quiet for a long moment. The steamboat moved slowly south. The cottonwood leaves came down. Give me a week, she said finally. Stay in Hannibal for a week. Talk to me properly. Meet Thomas and Clara. If at the end of the week you still want to marry me, and if I still want to marry you, then I will come to Colorado. A week, Raymond agreed. You could probably use the rest, she said, and this time the small sound she made was definitely a laugh. Raymond Garrison stayed at the Central Hotel on Main Street, which was modest and clean, and the next day being Sunday, he found himself sitting in the First Methodist Church of Hannibal listening to a sermon about diligence, which he felt was aimed at him personally, sitting 2 rows back from Susanna Thatcher and her younger brother and sister, who both turned to look at him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of young people who had heard about him and were making their own assessments. Thomas Thatcher was a tall young man of 17 with dark eyes like his sister's and an expression that combined wariness with a kind of suppressed energy that spoke of someone who wanted more room than he had. He shook Raymond's hand after the service with a firm grip and looked him straight in the eye and said, Susanna says you rode for days, in a tone that suggested he was reserving judgment but was interested. I did, Raymond said. Why? Thomas asked. Because it needed doing, Raymond said. Thomas considered this. I could learn cattle, he said. I don't doubt it, Raymond said. Clara was 14 and had red ribbons in her hair, and looked at Raymond with enormous brown eyes, and then turned to Susanna and whispered something that made Susanna's cheeks go pink. Raymond pretended not to notice, which was a significant feat of self-discipline. The week unfolded in the particular golden way of early October in Missouri, the kind of week that seems like the year's final gift before winter closes in. Raymond and Susanna walked along the riverfront in the mornings before she went to work, talking with the easy continuity of people who had already done 6 months of getting to know each other, and were now simply following the conversation in person. He met her at the dry goods store in the afternoons and walked her home, and in the evenings she and Thomas and Clara and Raymond sat in the small parlor of the boarding house, Mrs. Potts allowing this with the door open and her own presence in the adjacent room, and talked about everything. He told Thomas about cattle and horses and the open country. Thomas had never been out of Missouri, and he leaned forward listening with his whole body and asked questions rapid fire, and was not embarrassed about how much he didn't know. There was something uncalculated and alive in the boy that Raymond recognized the quality of someone who had been meant for larger spaces and was only waiting to find them. Clara showed Raymond her drawings, small, careful pencil sketches she made in a notebook, portraits of people and animals and the river, done with a talent that was genuine and obvious. Raymond told her they were good. She looked at him with immense seriousness and said, I know, but I am glad you said so. He and Susanna had the important conversations. About money, he was not wealthy but was stable, and the ranch was his outright, no mortgage. She was not bringing money but was bringing skills, labor, and a capacity for hard work that any honest accounting would value. About children, both of them wanted them eventually, when the time was right. About the isolation of ranch life. Susanna said she had read about life on the Colorado frontier, and it did not frighten her. What frightened her, she said, was staying in Hannibal making other people's curtains for the rest of her life. About Mrs. Potts, Raymond said he bore the woman no ill will, and Susanna said she appreciated that. On Thursday, their 5th day, they were sitting on a bench in the Riverside Park again, in the late afternoon when the light came off the water at a low angle and turned everything amber, and Raymond said, "I need to get back to Colorado before winter sets in proper. I've got a hired man who's been watching the cattle, but it's not a permanent arrangement." "I know," Susanna said. "I meant what I said about Thomas and Clara," he said. "The offer stands. Thomas can work for wages, fair ones, and Clara can continue her schooling in Canyon City. There's a decent school there." Susanna looked at the river. The amber light moved on the water in slow, shifting patterns. "I want to say yes," she said quietly. "I have been wanting to say yes since approximately the moment you walked into the dry goods store covered in trail dust and looking like you'd fought your way across 2 states. Raymond said nothing, giving her the space to finish. "I am afraid," she said. "Not of you. I want to be clear about that. I'm afraid of wanting something very much and then losing it. I have learned that the things you want most are the ones that cost you most when they go." "I understand that," he said. "I'm afraid of the same thing. It hasn't stopped me from being here." Susanna turned to look at him in the amber evening light, and what he saw in her face was not the careful composure she usually wore but something underneath it, something real and unguarded and entirely unforgettable. "I'm going to say yes," she said. "I would like to say yes now, while the light is like this and I am feeling brave." "Then say yes," he said. "Yes," said Susanna Thatcher, and Raymond Garrison's entire chest opened up like a window in spring. He reached over and took her hand where it lay on her knee, and she turned her hand palm up and closed her fingers around his, and they sat there in the amber October light with the Mississippi moving past them in its vast indifferent way, and the cottonwood trees shedding their last gold leaves. And it was, Raymond would later think, one of the best moments of his entire life. They were married the following Saturday, 8 days after Raymond rode into Hannibal, by the Methodist minister in a ceremony that had Thomas as Raymond's witness and Clara as Susanna's, with Mrs. Potts in the front pew looking somewhat chastened and somewhat proud and somewhat determined not to show either. Susanna wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and fit her well, and she had pinned a small cluster of late autumn asters in her hair that Clara had found at the market, and Raymond wore his good coat and had gotten another shave and looked, Thomas told him solemnly before the ceremony, respectable enough. When the minister said the words and Raymond slid the plain gold band he had bought at the Hannibal jewelers onto Susanna's finger, she looked up at him with those dark, watchful eyes, and he saw in them everything he had been riding toward for 4 days across the open country. After the ceremony, there was a small dinner at the boarding house, Mrs. Potts having apparently decided that if she was going to feel complicated feelings about the whole situation, she might as well feed everyone. She had made a proper roast and 3 pies and had set the large parlor table with her good tablecloth, and it was genuinely warm and generous of her, and Raymond told her so, and Mrs. Potts said, "Well," and busied herself with the gravy. They left Hannibal 3 days later in the 2nd week of October 1882, the 4 of them, Raymond and Susanna and Thomas and Clara, with everything they could pack into a modest pile of trunks and bags at the rail depot. Thomas was taut with suppressed excitement, and Clara was clutching her drawing notebook and trying to appear composed, and Susanna stood on the platform with her gray wool coat and her sensible bonnet, and looked at the town she was leaving with an expression that was clear-eyed and uncomplicated. "Are you all right?" Raymond asked, standing beside her. "I am very much all right," she said. She slipped her hand through the crook of his arm. I am just saying goodbye to something that never quite fit me, and it requires a moment of acknowledgement even so. Take all the time you need, he said. She took approximately 30 seconds, and then she turned to face west with the October light on her face and something in her posture that had changed. Some particular quality of resolution, like a tree that has just put its roots down deep and is no longer worried about the wind. They took the train west from Hannibal through Missouri and Kansas, changing lines in Kansas City, and the journey was long and rattling. And Clara drew everything she saw from the windows, and Thomas pressed his face to the glass watching the land change as they went west, getting bigger and flatter and more sky-filled with every hour. And Raymond sat across from Susanna in the train car, and they talked for most of the journey in the low, quiet way of two people who have a great deal of catching up to do and are not in any hurry. She told him things she hadn't put in the letters. She told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher and a reader, and had died of pneumonia when Susanna was 20, and Thomas and Clara were young, and about the 3 years that followed, which she described in plain terms without self-pity, working every hour she had and managing the household and making sure Thomas stayed in school because it mattered to him, and it mattered to her. She told him about the small indignities of being an unmarried woman in a Missouri River town with no money and no family connections, the way people's eyes slid past you, the way your options narrowed by the year. She told him about writing that first letter to the correspondence agency, how her hands had shaken because it was the most terrifying thing she had ever done and also the bravest, reaching out across the country toward something unknown on the theory that something unknown might be better than something familiar and limited. I was afraid you wouldn't write back, she said. After the first letter, I thought you would read it and think it was too bare and too careful and not write back. I wrote back the same day I got it, Raymond said. I know, Mrs. Potts thought you were alarming, a small smile. I thought you were wonderful. Raymond looked out the window at the darkening Kansas plain for a moment. What made you decide to trust it? He asked. Trust the letters, trust me. Susanna was quiet for a moment. The letter about your brother, she said finally. When you wrote about Cal going to Wyoming and how you didn't agree with his choices but you understood the feeling behind them, the wanting something bigger, and you said you hoped he found it even if you disagreed about the method. She paused. A man who can say that about his brother, who can hold the disagreement and the love at the same time without resolving one into the other, that man is telling you something true about himself. Raymond looked at her. She was looking at her hands in her lap, turning the plain gold ring on her finger the way you do with a new ring, still learning the weight of it. That is a perceptive thing to notice, he said. I am a perceptive person, she said simply, and then glanced up at him with something that was almost mischief in it, a flash of dry humor he had seen in the letters but was different in person, more alive, more present. Mrs. Potts failed to mention that in her letter. Raymond laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and doesn't have any self-consciousness in it. And across the train car, Thomas looked up from the window and Clara looked up from her notebook, and they both grinned. And the train carried them all west into the late October dark toward Colorado. They arrived in Canyon City on a Thursday afternoon with the Rockies visible to the west, enormous and white-capped, and exactly as Raymond had described. And Clara pressed her face to the train window and made a sound of pure involuntary wonder. And even Thomas went quiet in a way that was better than any words. Susanna sat forward in her seat and looked at the mountains with an expression Raymond could not fully read but knew was important. Well, she said softly. Well, he agreed. His nearest neighbor, Hector Aldrich, was at the depot with a wagon. Hector was a big sunburned man of about 45 who had a handshake like a bench vice and a manner that was blunt but warm, and he looked at Susanna and said, Mrs. Garrison. Raymond's told me a great deal about you, which was only partly true since Raymond had left a note saying he was going to Missouri and would be back with a wife. But Susanna smiled, and said it was good to meet him, and Hector looked mildly dazzled, which pleased Raymond enormously, though he kept this to himself. The drive out to the ranch was 10 miles on a road that got rougher as it went, through limestone canyons and along the river and then out onto the open spread of the high plain, and the late October sky was enormous above them, deeper blue than Missouri sky, sharper-edged and colder, and the land was wide and dry and studded with sage, and the distant cattle were visible as dark dots on the brown grass, and all of it was Raymond's, their land, and he watched Susanna take it in. She did not say much on the drive. She looked at everything carefully, the way she did everything, turning it in her mind. Thomas had about 100 questions for Hector, who answered all of them with the patient tolerance of a man who had raised 6 children and was therefore inured to questions. Clara was sketching the landscape in her notebook, trying to capture the scale of the mountains, which was, she said with some frustration, impossible. The house came into view at last: 3 rooms, 2 windows, a long low porch across the front, the stable and the outbuildings behind it, a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that ran at the property's east edge. It was modest and honest, and standing there in the late afternoon light with the mountains behind it, it looked like what it was, the beginning of something. Raymond helped Susanna down from the wagon and they stood looking at the house. "It is as you described," she said. "I wanted you to know exactly what you were coming to." She took a breath of the cold, dry Colorado air. "It smells different here, cleaner, more empty. You'll get used to it." "I think I already like it," she said, and walked up the porch steps and through the front door of her new house. The first weeks were a period of adjustment and discovery that was both harder and better than Raymond had expected. Susanna was efficient and practical in the way of someone who had been running a household since she was 20, and she reorganized the kitchen in the first 3 days with a systematic thoroughness that resulted in everything being in a slightly different place than Raymond was used to, which caused him to reach for the coffee where it used to be 3 times before he learned where it now was. He did not say anything about this. He also noted that she had put curtains up at the 2 windows using material from a bolt of fabric she had brought in her trunk, and the house looked different with them, warmer, inhabited in a deliberate way rather than merely occupied. Thomas settled into ranch work with an aptitude that was gratifying and unsurprising. He was strong and quick learning, and had a natural ease with horses that Raymond recognized as a real gift, and within 2 weeks he was handling jobs that most new hands would have taken a month to master. Raymond paid him fair wages as promised, and Thomas received them with a seriousness that spoke of someone who had understood scarcity and would not take earning lightly. Clara enrolled in the Canyon City School and came home each day with a full account of everyone she had met and everything she had observed, and a portfolio of sketches done during lessons whenever the subject matter failed to engage her, which apparently was frequent. Her teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Everton, sent a note home after the first week saying that Clara was extremely bright and also drew pictures of her classmates during geography, but that the drawings were very good, so she was uncertain how to respond. Susanna wrote to her students about this and laughed about it with Raymond over supper. And those suppers, the 4 of them around the rough-hewn table in the kitchen, with the fire going and the wind outside, and the lamp casting its warm circle, became the rhythm of their days, the fixed point around which everything else moved. He and Susanna were finding their way toward each other in the particular intimate and careful way of 2 people who married each other in good faith, and are now discovering whether the good faith was well placed. The letters had done real work. They were not strangers, but the body is different from the page, and there were adjustments, the small negotiations of shared space and shared days and shared silence. He learned that she woke before him and liked the first hour of the day quiet, and he adapted to this by moving quietly in the early mornings until she had had her tea and was ready for conversation. She learned that he had a deep need for occasional solitude and understood it as something structural rather than personal. And when he needed an hour alone with the horses or a long ride out along the fence line, she read that need correctly and did not take it as a withdrawal. The thing he had not entirely anticipated was how much he liked her. Not just loved, that was growing steadily and was not in question, but liked in the specific way of finding someone's company genuinely, reliably good. She was funny, in a dry and precise way that was entirely at odds with her composed exterior, and frequently caught him off guard. And she was curious about everything. And she had opinions that she held with conviction but adjusted when presented with good evidence, which was rarer than it should be. She read everything she could get her hands on, and they began a habit of reading aloud to each other in the evenings after Thomas and Clara went to bed, taking turns with whatever book they had. And those evenings by the fire with the book between them became something Raymond had not known he was missing his whole adult life. She, in turn, was learning him. He saw her doing it, the careful perceptive attention she brought to everything applied to him, filing away what she saw with that methodical thoroughness. She learned when he was tired versus when he was worried, learned the difference between his working silences and his troubled ones, and one evening in late November she came out to the stable where he was working on a harness by lantern light and said, "What's wrong?" Without preamble, and he looked up and said, "The eastern pasture fence is down in 2 places, and we're probably going to lose cattle if it snows hard before I can fix it." And she sat down on a hay bale and said, "Tell me what you need." And they talked it through together and found a solution. And he thought as he watched her concentrate in the lantern light that no one in 7 years had asked him that question, "What do you need?" And that it was possible to not know how much you had been missing something until it arrived. November became December, and the Colorado winter arrived in earnest, the temperature dropping to single digits, and the sky going a deep iron gray, and the first serious snow coming before Christmas in 3 feet that blanketed everything into an immense white quiet. The mountains disappeared behind cloud for days at a time, and the cattle moved in close to the sheltered areas, and Thomas and Raymond spent long cold days keeping the water troughs from freezing and the feed moving and the animals sorted. On Christmas Eve, Susanna made a proper Christmas dinner with a chicken from their small flock and potatoes, and a dried apple pie that was the best thing Raymond had eaten in recent memory. And Clara put pine boughs on the table and drew portraits of everyone as Christmas gifts. Raymond's was remarkably good, catching something in his face that he wasn't aware of, but that Susanna said was exactly right. Thomas gave Susanna a small wooden box he had made from scraps in the stable, dovetailed at the corners with a care and precision that spoke of real effort. Raymond gave Susanna a small leather-bound journal he had ordered from the bookseller in Canyon City, because she wrote things down and her old notebook was nearly full, and she held it in both hands and looked up at him with an expression that he would not have been able to describe but which he felt in his whole body. After supper, with Thomas and Clara gone to their rooms, Raymond and Susanna sat by the fire in the front room, and the snow was deep outside, and the wind was quiet, and the fire was warm, and Susanna was sitting close beside him on the settee she had brought from Missouri in the big trunk, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly. "Tell me," he said. "I have been happy," she said. "Not in a simple way, not without difficulty, but genuinely really happy. I want you to know that I see what you have built here, what you are building. And I want you to know that I am glad I said yes. I am glad you rode 4 days. I am glad Mrs. Potts wrote that terrible word because it brought you here, and I am very glad you are here." Raymond put his arm around her, and she settled against him in the firelight, and the snow was deep outside, and the mountains were invisible in the winter darkness, and somewhere out in the dark. The cattle were warm and the horses were settled in the stable, and Thomas and Clara were asleep in their rooms, and the fire was burning well, and everything was, for this moment, completely and entirely right. "I love you," he said, because it was true, and it was the right time to say it, and he had been a man alone on the open country for too long to waste good moments. Susanna was quiet for a beat, and then she said, with her head still against his shoulder, "I love you too, Raymond." And the fire snapped, and the wind moved along the eaves of the house, and neither of them said anything else for a long time because nothing else needed saying. The winter passed with that particular combination of hardship and warmth that defines frontier winters, genuinely difficult in the practical physical sense, cold and demanding and unforgiving about the things that needed doing, but counterbalanced by the enforced proximity of the house and the fire, and the 4 people in it finding their way into a family. There were hard days. A January blizzard that kept them storm-bound for 4 days, during which cabin fever set in, and Thomas and Raymond had a brief but sharp argument about the proper way to recoil rope that was entirely about something else, and both of them knew it. And Susanna waited it out with admirable patience, and then said to both of them, "That's enough," in the tone she had presumably used to manage 2 younger siblings through hard years, and it worked. And then they all played cards for 2 hours, and the tension dissolved. There were days when the cold got into Raymond's bones in ways that kept him awake, and Susanna, without making any comment about it, took to keeping a small fire going in their room through the night, and bringing him hot coffee before it was light. There were days when Susanna's letters to her friends in Missouri went unanswered for weeks, and the isolation of the high plains pressed at her in ways she tried to manage alone before Raymond noticed and asked, and she told him honestly, and they talked about it honestly, and he made a point of getting to town and finding her people to talk to. Other ranch wives along the river valley who were her people in waiting, women who had faced the same thing and come through it. The nearest of these was a woman named Margaret Aldrich, Hector's wife, who was 42 and had been on the Colorado frontier for 15 years, and who took one look at Susanna on their first real visit in February and said, "Oh good, someone sensible," and proceeded to become one of the firmest friendships Susanna had ever formed. They had a lot in common: a certain practical intelligence, a dry sense of humor, a refusal to pretend that frontier life was romantic when it was actually just hard work, and their weekly visits through the late winter became something Susanna looked forward to visibly, her posture lightening when Hector's wagon came up the road with Margaret in it. Spring came to the Colorado high plains the way it always does, tentatively and then suddenly, the snow going back first along the south-facing slopes and then from the flats, the creek rising with melt water and the grass coming green in the low places, the cattle moving out onto the new growth with a purposeful energy. Raymond spent the early spring working fence, and the herd in long days that ended with him, sunburned and tired and profoundly content in the way of a man who knows what his work is for. Thomas was a genuine working hand now, confident and capable, and they had a shorthand between them that had developed out of shared days and was easy and real. Susanna planted a kitchen garden in April, with Thomas's help turning the hard ground, and put in everything she knew how to grow: potatoes and beans and onions and squash, and, in a small corner sheltered from the wind, flowers. Just a few. Zinnias and cosmos, seeds she had brought from Missouri in a small paper envelope that had been in the bottom of her trunk since Hannibal. Raymond came out one morning to find her on her knees in the garden in the early spring sunshine, patting earth around seedlings with an expression of deep satisfaction, and he stood at the fence and looked at her in the morning light and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had rooted herself here, that she had decided this was home, and was making it so with her own hands. In May, Susanna told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen after supper on a Tuesday evening, with Thomas and Clara already asleep, while she was washing the dishes and he was sitting at the table with the account book. She just said it in a matter-of-fact voice, "I believe I am with child, Raymond," and then kept washing the dish she was washing because she was Susanna and she was not one for theatrical delivery. Raymond set down the pen. "Are you certain?" Reasonably, I will see Dr. Haverson in town this week to confirm. He got up from the table and walked over to where she was standing at the wash basin, and she turned to look at him with soapy hands and an expression that had its composure intact, but was also doing something else entirely in the eyes, something warm and hoping and just slightly afraid. And he took both her soapy hands in his and said nothing at all, just looked at her. And she exhaled what sounded like a long-held breath and leaned her forehead against his chest. "We are going to need more room," she said against his shirt. "We are," he agreed. "I'll start on the addition in June." She looked up. "You can build." "I can build adequately," he said. "And Hector Aldrich builds excellently. Between us we'll manage." She laughed, the real warm laugh, and he held her hands in his and they stood in the kitchen while the lamp burned and the spring night was cold outside the window, and something shifted in the house, some quality of potential becoming actual, possibility becoming fact. The spring and early summer passed in a fullness that Raymond, looking back on the lean years before, found almost difficult to believe had been arrived at from that starting point. The cattle were in good condition going into summer, the calf crop healthy, the prices in Pueblo decent. Thomas had saved enough of his wages to send back to Hannibal for a second-hand saddle he had been wanting, and Raymond watched the boy ride out on a morning in June with that saddle, and felt something paternal and unexpected in his chest. Clara had finished her first school year in Canyon City having made 3 close friends, 1 small enemy, and a teacher who wrote on her final report that she was exceptional in all subjects and should be encouraged toward formal artistic training in the future, which Clara read aloud at supper with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. The addition to the house went up in June, and July with Raymond and Hector and Thomas putting in long days on it. It added 2 rooms to the east side of the original structure, a bedroom for Thomas and a second bedroom that would serve as the baby's room, and it also extended the kitchen by enough that Susanna could work in it without feeling like she was fighting the furniture. The new construction was sound and straight, and when it was finished, Susanna went through each new room with a critical eye, and then said it was well done, and Margaret Aldrich came over and agreed and brought a bread pudding to celebrate, which was consumed immediately. On a hot July evening when the work was done, and the house was cool inside with the cross ventilation from the new windows, Raymond came in from the stable to find Susanna sitting on the front porch in the rocking chair she had gradually made her own, watching the evening come down over the high plain and the mountains going pink in the last light. She was showing obviously now, 7 months along, her hands resting on her lap, and she had that particular stillness she got sometimes that was not tiredness, but simply the quality of someone who is fully present in a moment. Raymond sat down on the porch step and leaned against the post, and they looked at the mountains going pink and then amber and then a deep rose in the late sky. "I keep thinking about something," Susanna said. "Tell me," he said. "I keep thinking about that letter, Mrs. Potts's letter." She paused, turning the ring on her finger in its habitual way. "About that word, and I keep trying to decide how to feel about it." Raymond waited. "I think," she said slowly, "that the word was wrong. Not just about me, but as a way of seeing, as though a person's surface is what they are, as though what the eye takes in immediately is the whole account." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been looked past my whole life. In Hannibal it was a daily thing, being invisible, and I think I had learned to accept that as fact about myself rather than as a failure of observation in other people." "It was a failure of observation," Raymond said. "Yes," she said. "I know that now. I know it because of how you see me." She looked at him, and the evening light was on her face, and everything that was real and deep in her was visible in this moment, unguarded and clear. "You see me, Raymond. You have always seen me, from the letters. You read what I wrote and saw what I meant, and then you rode 4 days, and then you stood in the dry goods store and you looked at me, and I have never been looked at like that in my life." Raymond said nothing for a moment. The pink was fading from the mountains and the evening star was appearing in the western sky above the peaks. "You are the least forgettable person I have ever known," he said. You are the most present person in any room you enter. You always have been." Mrs. Potts was looking at the outside and finding nothing, and the tragedy is that you were right there the whole time. Susanna's eyes were bright in the evening. She looked down at her hands and then back up at him and said quietly, "Thank you. I needed to hear that said plainly." "I'll say it as often as you need it," he said. "Once more ought to do it," she said, and the dry, gentle humor in it was so entirely her that he laughed and she laughed, and the evening star brightened and the mountains went purple in the dusk, and out in the pasture the cattle moved slowly in the late light, and it was, like so many moments had been and would be, perfectly full. Their son was born on the 14th of September, 1883, in the ranch house with Dr. Haverson and Margaret Aldrich attending, on a morning when the first cool edge of fall was in the Colorado air, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to turn. Raymond spent most of the labor outside with Thomas, finding reasons to be busy with the horses and failing entirely to actually be busy, and Thomas was steady in that way he had become, not calm exactly but purposeful, and he handed Raymond a cup of coffee at about 8 in the morning and said, "She's going to be fine, you know," in a tone that was young but utterly certain. "I know," Raymond said. "She's the strongest person either of us knows," Thomas said. "That's absolutely true," Raymond said. At 10:17 in the morning, Margaret Aldrich opened the door and said, "You have a son, Raymond. Come see your wife," and Raymond went inside. The baby was red-faced and indignant about existence and wrapped in the white flannel blanket Susanna had been making all summer, and Susanna was pale and exhausted and entirely victorious-looking, propped on pillows in the bed Raymond had built last spring, holding the baby against her chest. She looked up when Raymond came in, and the expression on her face was something he had no words for and did not need any, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at his wife and felt something close and complete around him like weather. "He's perfect," he said. "He is very loud," Susanna said, but she was looking at the baby with an expression that made very loud sound like high praise. "What are we calling him?" Susanna looked up at him. They had discussed names but not decided. "I thought," she said, "if you agreed, I thought perhaps James, for your father." Raymond's father had been dead for 12 years and had been a good man, and Raymond had not talked about him as often as perhaps he should have, but Susanna had listened to the things he had said and filed them away in that thorough way she had. "James," he said, and the name settled into place like something that had been waiting. "James William Garrison," Susanna said, "after your father and mine." Raymond looked at his wife and his son in the fall morning light, and was entirely undone by it in the quiet, private way that men like him get undone. No dramatics, just the profound and absolute certainty that this was it. This was the whole point and purpose of every hard year. Of the ranch built alone in the cold, and the letters written to a woman in Missouri, and the 4 days across Kansas, and the word in Mrs. Potts's letter that had meant to diminish and instead had set something in motion that ended here in this room with this woman and this child. "Thank you," he said. Susanna looked up at him. "For what?" "For saying yes," he said. "For saying yes while the light was like that." Her smile was tired and real and entirely her. "I have very good timing," she said. James William Garrison was, from his first months, everything. Both his parents were in combination, watchful and curious and precise about things that mattered, with his father's steadiness and his mother's dry humor appearing in embryonic form startlingly early. He also had very strong opinions about when he wanted to sleep, which was never, and strong opinions about being set down, which were similar. Raymond spent a considerable number of early mornings of the fall of 1883 walking the baby in the front room while Susanna got a few hours of sleep. And this time, the dark, quiet house, the baby in the crook of his arm, the fire low, the stars outside the window, was something Raymond would remember for the rest of his life as a particular kind of sacred. Clara turned 15 that fall and had by now become a fixture of the Canyon City social world in the way that bright and vivid young people do, known to everyone, friend to most, a particular favorite of the school's art teacher who had taken Clara's talent seriously and given her access to real materials, oil paint and proper paper and instruction. Her drawings had expanded into painting, and the paintings were startling in their quality. The scale of the Colorado landscape caught in ways that seemed too accomplished for a 15-year-old. And Margaret Aldrich told Susanna flatly that Clara needed proper instruction, and that there was a painter in Denver who taught students, and that something should be arranged. Something was eventually arranged, though it took 2 more years, and Clara being 17, and she went to Denver to study for a year, and came back with a portfolio that silenced a room and the unshakable intention to paint for the rest of her life, which she did. Thomas, in the meantime, had become so integral to the ranch operation that Raymond began to think of the thing as a partnership rather than an employer arrangement. And in the spring of 1884, he put that thought into explicit words over supper, and offered Thomas a formal share in the ranch going forward in exchange for continued work, and a modest buy-in over time from his wages. Thomas looked at the table for a long moment and then looked at Raymond and said, "You don't have to do that." And Raymond said, "I know I don't have to." "I want to," and Thomas said, "All right then," in a voice that was steady but barely, and Susanna from her end of the table said nothing at all and looked at her plate and pressed her lips together because she was emotional and would not show it, which Raymond recognized and found deeply endearing. Life on the ranch in those years had the quality of something being built in real time, not built and then lived in, but built and lived in simultaneously, each season adding something, each difficulty met and managed and added to the account of what they were capable of. The cattle operation expanded gradually, responsibly, Raymond's conservative instincts keeping the growth sustainable. A small stable fire in the winter of 1884 that was caught early and managed without major loss. A dry summer in 1885 that made the grazing difficult and required Raymond and Thomas to sell more cattle than planned and reduce the herd for the season, which was a hard economic decision that Raymond and Susanna worked through together over the account books at the kitchen table. Susanna's clear head and her capacity for honest arithmetic making what could have been a crisis into a manageable problem. The community around them grew too, the way frontier communities do, slowly and solidly, new families coming in along the river valley and establishing themselves. And Susanna became part of the texture of the community in a way that she had never been in Hannibal, where she had been invisible by circumstance. Here she was seen, known, sought out for her practicality, her good counsel, her willingness to help anyone who needed it without requiring anything in return, except that they not waste her time with foolishness. When the second baby was coming, in the spring of 1885, Susanna told Raymond with the same matter-of-fact delivery as the first time, at the wash basin in the kitchen in the evening, and this time he was ready for it, and she had barely gotten the words out before he had his arms around her, and she made a surprised sound that was also a laugh, muffled against his shoulder. 2 years, he said. James will have a sibling 2 years younger. He will cope, Susanna said. He is extremely competent. He is 19 months old, and already extremely competent, she said. Their daughter was born in October 1885, a year and a day after James, which Susanna found quietly funny and said was evidence of good scheduling. They named her Eliza Jane, after no one in particular except that Susanna had always liked the name, and the Jane was for Margaret Aldrich's middle name, because Margaret had been there for both births and deserved acknowledgement. Eliza was, from her first hours, a more peaceful baby than James had been, and James took to her with an interested possessive affection that expressed itself largely in bringing her objects and then taking them back, which was, Dr. Haverson said, developmentally normal. Raymond stood in the kitchen of the house he had built and expanded on the land he had fought for, and looked at Susanna nursing the baby in the rocking chair by the fire with James sitting at her feet, with a wooden horse Thomas had carved for him. And the winter light was flat and clear outside the windows, and the mountains were visible today, sharp and white. And he thought about the Tuesday morning in October 1882, when he had sat at the rough-hewn table with a letter and a coffee cup, and read a word that did not belong in the same sentence as Susanna Thatcher. He thought about the 4 days of riding, which he had never regretted for a single moment. He thought about the dry goods store, and the woman on the step stool who had gone still when she saw him, those dark watchful eyes, and the park by the river and the amber light, and her saying yes while the light was like that. He was 34 years old. He had a wife he loved with a steadiness that had only deepened in 3 years, who made him laugh every day and whom he admired every day, who had rooted herself in this hard, beautiful country like she had always belonged here. He had a son who was 2 and already showed signs of being alarmingly thoughtful. He had a daughter who was 3 months old and already appeared to have opinions. He had a brother-in-law who was his partner and his friend. He had a sister-in-law who was going to be a painter of real significance and had already sold 3 paintings to a Denver hotel, which Clara reported with the satisfaction of someone whose talent has been formally confirmed by money. He had built the thing. Not alone, he had built it with Susanna, and Susanna had built it with him, and they had built it together out of 6 months of letters and a 4-day ride and a word that was wrong in a park by the Mississippi and a yes said in amber October light. Susanna looked up from the baby and found him looking at her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking." "You're staring," she said. "You have the expression you get when you are thinking about something you consider significant." "You can read me too well," he said. "I have had 3 years of practice," she said. The baby made a small sound and Susanna shifted her, and her eyes were warm and a little amused in the way they got when she was at ease, when she was entirely herself. "Come sit with us," she said. Raymond crossed the kitchen and pulled a chair up beside the rocking chair and sat down, and James abandoned the wooden horse and climbed onto his father's lap with the unself-conscious confidence of a toddler who knows perfectly well he is welcome there. And Susanna looked at the baby and Raymond looked at Susanna, and the fire burned, and the winter light lay flat and clear across the mountains in the window, and the house was warm and full. There are moments in a life that you recognize in the present tense as the ones that matter, not retrospectively, not in the soft focus of memory, but right now, with the weight of the child on your knee and the fire at your back and your wife's face in the winter light. Raymond Garrison was not a man of many words and did not tend toward speeches even in the privacy of his own head. But in this moment, he had one clear and entire thought, that he was grateful beyond accounting for the particular path that had led here, for the letter and the word and the 4 days of riding across Kansas in October, for Susanna's careful handwriting and her dry humor and her dark, watchful eyes and her yes in the amber light. He leaned over and kissed her temple, and she tipped her head slightly toward him without looking up from the baby and said, very quietly, "I know," because she always did. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are, full of work and difficulty and growth and ordinary days that were better than anyone who hadn't earned them could appreciate. The ranch expanded in 1887 when Raymond and Thomas bought the adjacent parcel to the east, doubling the grazing land and allowing them to run close to 800 head, which was a real operation by any measure. Thomas hired 2 additional hands that year, steady men from a neighboring county, and managed them with an authority that he wore as naturally as his boots. Thomas had, in the winter of 1886, met a woman named Priscilla Watts at a church social in Canyon City. She was 21, the daughter of an apple orchardist, with red hair and a direct manner, and a sense of humor that matched Thomas's in both register and frequency. They were married in the spring of 1887 in the Canyon City Methodist Church with the whole community in attendance, and Susanna stood up as her brother's witness and Raymond stood up as his partners, and Clara came back from Denver for the wedding, and painted a portrait of the couple as a wedding gift that was so good that Priscilla cried, which Clara accepted as the appropriate response. Priscilla moved into the ranch house in the east extension room that had been Thomas's, and the household adjusted to accommodate her with relatively little friction, largely because Priscilla was practical and warm, and had the quality of someone who understood what she was joining and respected it. She and Susanna established within about 3 weeks a working relationship that was friendly and clear-boundaried in the right ways, and by summer they were easy with each other in the manner of women who have decided they will be allies rather than competitors and are proceeding accordingly. James turned 5 in September 1888 and started school at the Canyon City School, and came home each day with lengthy and detailed accounts of everything that had happened, delivered with the precision of someone who had been listening carefully, which was his mother in miniature. He was, his teacher wrote in a note home after the first month, unusually attentive for his age, and had already demonstrated a capacity for reading that put him well ahead of his classmates. Eliza, at 3, was conducting a long and intensive investigation of the ranch's resident animals, an inquiry that involved spending as much time as possible with the horses and the cattle dogs and the 3 barn cats who had taken up residence in the stable, and which resulted in a thorough first-hand education in animal behavior that she pursued with the single-mindedness of a small scientist. On a September evening in 1888, James's 5th birthday, the day he started school, the same month 6 years before that Raymond had read a letter in a rough-hewn kitchen and saddled his horse Raymond, and Susanna sat on the porch after supper watching the last of the day go off the mountains. Children were inside, Thomas and Priscilla at their end of the house, the cattle out in the late summer grass, the creek running somewhere in the dark, the evening star sharp and clear above the peaks. "Do you remember the park?" Susanna said. "Every detail," he said. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "About what would have happened if I had said something different, or if you hadn't come, if you'd written a letter instead." "I couldn't write a letter about that," he said. "Some things need to be said in person." "Yes," she said. "I understand that now better than I did then." She was quiet for a moment, turning the ring on her finger, a gesture so habitual she probably didn't know she was doing it. "I was so afraid that day. When you walked in, I thought I was certain it was going to turn into something disappointing, that you would see me and recalculate. I walked in and saw you on that step stool and thought, Mrs. Potts has never looked at a person in her life," Raymond said. Susanna laughed, warm and real. "That is both kind and possibly unfair to Mrs. Potts." "Mrs. Potts is fine," Raymond said. "She made an excellent roast at the wedding dinner. I hold no grievances." "She wrote to me last spring," Susanna said. "Did I tell you?" "She wrote to say she was glad it had worked out. She said she thought she might have been. She said she worried she had been hasty in some of her judgments. She was not quite apologizing exactly, but it was adjacent to an apology." "Did you write back?" "I wrote back a very kind letter," Susanna said, "because she is an old woman who tried to help in the way she knew how, and whatever the result of her method, the intention was not cruel." A pause. "And because I find I am enormously grateful for the general chain of events that Mrs. Potts set in motion, even if I objected to some of the links." "As do I," Raymond said. Susanna leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had on that first Christmas Eve, so long ago now, and they looked at the mountains and the evening star and the first faint dusting of stars beginning to show in the deep Colorado sky. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said, the same as always. "I am pregnant again," she said. Raymond was quiet for a moment, not from surprise but from the particular fullness of it, the way good news can be so much that it takes a moment to hold. "When?" he asked. "April, I think," she said. "Maybe May." April or May of 1889. He did the arithmetic. James would be 5.5, Eliza 3.5. Priscilla, as it happened, was expecting in February. The house would be a very full place by summer. "We will need to add another room," he said. "We will," she agreed. "I'll talk to Hector this week." "You do that," she said. He kissed the top of her head, and she made a quiet, contented sound, and they sat together on the porch of the house. They had built in the high Colorado plain, with the mountains dark against the last of the evening sky, and the creek running somewhere in the cottonwoods, and the full, quiet life of the place surrounding them. And it was everything. Their third child, a son they named William Will, he was called from the start, arrived in the last days of April 1889, healthy and loud, and immediately opinionated in the manner of all the Garrison children. Priscilla had given birth to a boy in February, named Aldrich Thomas Garrison, called Aldo, who would grow up inseparable from his cousin Will to a degree that entertained and occasionally exhausted the adults in the house. Clara wrote from Denver when she heard about Will, a letter that arrived in May full of news about her work and a painting commission she had received, and a question about whether Susanna thought she ought to take a studio in Denver permanently rather than just renting. She came home for a visit in June and sat at the table and looked around the full, busy house. 3 children, Priscilla and Aldo, Thomas and Raymond in from the ranch work, sunburned and tired, Susanna managing the whole enterprise with her characteristic combination of efficiency and dry humor, and said, "You have built something remarkable here," with a directness that was entirely Clara. "We have," Susanna said. "Raymond," Clara said, turning to look at him across the table, "you should know that I think you are a very good man. I have been meaning to say so for some time." "Thank you, Clara," Raymond said. "I also think you have good taste," she said, "for which I am personally grateful since it resulted in my being here." "Your sister had something to do with it," Raymond said. "My sister said yes," Clara said. "But you rode 4 days." She looked back and forth between them in a considered way. "That is a thing that wants marking." "It has been marked," Susanna said, meeting Raymond's eyes across the table with something that had 6 years of love in it, and the exact quality of that amber October evening by the Mississippi, unchanged and present and entirely real. Clara stayed a week, and then returned to Denver with 4 pages of new sketches of the children and the ranch and the mountains, which would become, over the next several years, a series of paintings that eventually found their way to a gallery in Chicago, and then to a museum collection, where they were hung in a room of Western landscapes with small labels that said, in part, "Canyon City Ranch Series, 1889, the artist's childhood home." Clara always corrected this when it came up, saying it was not her childhood home, but the home she had been given when she needed one, which she considered better. In the years after, things happened as things do, slowly and quickly, ordinary and extraordinary, the days that were hard and the days that were easy and the many days that were both. James grew into a boy who read everything and wanted to know how things worked, who apprenticed himself to Hector Aldrich's mechanical mind on weekends, and developed a talent for machinery that Raymond could see leading somewhere significant. Eliza never lost her deep interest in animals and expanded it into a practical knowledge of livestock husbandry that by the time she was 10 was genuinely useful on the ranch, and she had the habit of naming every individual animal she dealt with regularly, which was a source of some amusement to Thomas and some inconvenience to Raymond, since it is harder to make practical decisions about a steer with a name. Will was the most like Susanna in manner, watchful and precise, and capable of a silence that was full of attention, and he had his father's ease with open country, an instinct for land and weather, and the natural world that expressed itself as the kind of quiet competence that gets more valuable as a boy grows. Raymond turned 40 in the spring of 1891. Susanna organized a dinner with the Aldriches and their family and Thomas and Priscilla and the children, and there was a proper cake and genuine celebration, and at the end of the evening when everyone had gone and the children were asleep, Susanna sat across from him at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at him in the lamplight. 40, she said. 40, he agreed. How do you feel? Good, he said, meaning it entirely. Very good. She looked at him with those dark eyes that still, after 9 years, could catch him off guard with the quality of what was in them. The intelligence and the warmth and the deep abiding realness of her. "I have been thinking," she said, "about something I want to do." "Tell me," he said. "I want to start a small school," she said. "Here on the ranch initially, for the ranch children and the neighboring families who can't always get children to town. There are enough children now in this valley, and the women have been talking about it, and I think it would serve real need." She paused. "I would like to teach." Raymond looked at his wife in the lamplight and thought about her father, the schoolteacher who had died and left her managing 3 lives at 20, and about the letters she had written from Hannibal about wanting to be somewhere she had chosen, and about the way she had stood on the porch and turned her face west with that quality of resolution. "Yes," he said, "I think you should do that." "I will need a building," she said, "or at least a dedicated room." "Talk to Thomas about the supply shed," he said. "We've been thinking about rebuilding it. We could build a room that doubles." Susanna nodded slowly, fitting the pieces together with that methodical care. "It would not be a full school," she said. "Not right away, but it could become one." "Most things start not being what they're going to be," Raymond said. She smiled across the table, that particular smile that was dry and warm and entirely hers. "I love you," she said, "in case you wondered." "I never wonder," he said, "but I am always glad to hear it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the hand with the plain gold band that had been on her finger since October of 1882, and the lamp burned warm, and the house was quiet with sleeping children, and the spring night was cool outside the window, and somewhere in the dark the creek was running in the cottonwoods. The same creek, the same land, the same house that was so much more than a house now. The school started in the spring of 1892 in the rebuilt supply shed, which Thomas and Raymond and 2 of the ranch hands had made into a clean, bright room with 4 proper windows, and a stove, and 10 desks ordered from a catalog in Kansas City. Susanna had 8 students the first term, including James and Eliza and Will and Aldo, and 4 children from neighboring ranches whose parents rode them over 3 days a week on horses or in wagons. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and natural history with the same clear-eyed thoroughness she brought to everything. And by the second term there were 12 students, and by the third term there were 15, and Hector Aldrich's daughter-in-law, who had been a schoolteacher in Nebraska, came to help with the upper grades. Word of the school spread along the river valley and brought a kind of credibility and gratitude from the community that Susanna accepted with characteristic practicality. She cared less about being thanked and more about whether the children were learning. But Raymond saw what it meant to her, the particular quality of purpose it gave the days, and he understood that she had taken the thing she had lost when her father died, the house full of books and learning, the sense of education as something worth fighting for, and had rebuilt it here on the high Colorado plain, made it hers again, made it something she had chosen. In the summer of 1893, a letter arrived from Cal Garrison, Raymond's younger brother, who had been in Wyoming for 11 years and with whom Raymond had maintained a sporadic but genuine correspondence. Cal was coming south, the letter said. The silver had not panned out, it rarely did, and he was tired of Wyoming winters and wanted to see his brother and meet the wife and children he had heard about in letters. Cal arrived in August on a bay horse, looking weathered and a little worn but fundamentally intact, thinner than Raymond remembered and with considerably more gray in his hair, but with the same restless intelligence in his eyes that Raymond associated with him. He stood in the yard and looked at the ranch, the expanded house, the stable, the school building, the kitchen garden that was at its summer height, the cattle on the pasture, and then he looked at Raymond and said, "You've done well, Ray." "We've done well," Raymond said, and introduced him to Susanna, who looked at Cal for a moment with her direct appraising gaze and then said, "You need feeding. Come inside," and that was that. Cal stayed 2 weeks and became genuinely fond of Susanna in the way all reasonable people did, and was mildly awed by the children, and helped with ranch work in the mornings with a willingness that spoke of someone who had been without purposeful work for too long. Before he left, he and Raymond took a long ride out along the eastern fence line in the August morning, the kind of ride brothers take when there are things to say that require space around them. "I've been wrong about some things," Cal said, out among the sage in the wide sky. "You were looking for something," Raymond said. "Nothing wrong with that." "I was looking for something out there," Cal said, gesturing vaguely north. "And it was here the whole time, I think. Not for me necessarily, but the thing itself, the building something, the staying." He looked at Raymond. "How did you know? How did you know to stay and build rather than chase?" Raymond thought about this honestly. "I don't know that I decided," he said. "I think I just knew this land was mine. And then Susanna came and it was ours, and that was enough." Cal nodded slowly, looking at the mountains. "I'm going to stop chasing," he said. "I think I am actually finished." "Come here then," Raymond said. "There's land for sale at the south end of the valley." Hector Aldrich has been watching it. Cal did come. He bought the land that fall, with money from the Wyoming years that was modest but real, and he built a small house and started a smaller cattle operation. And the two brothers were neighbors in the valley for the rest of their lives, which was a thing neither of them had expected and both of them valued without saying so directly, because they were men of that stripe, but said in other ways, in the regular habit of shared meals and work, and the particular ease of people who have known each other all their lives. By the end of 1893, the Garrison Ranch was a real and settled thing. 400 acres running to nearly 1,000 with the eastern parcel, a solid herd, a school that served 20 children 3 days a week, and was being discussed by the county as a candidate for formal recognition, a family that was healthy and real and had been built out of letters and 4 days of writing and a word that had been wrong. James was 10 and reading at an adult level, and had already written a letter to a mining engineer in Pueblo asking questions about hydraulic systems, because he had read about them in a magazine and wanted to understand, which the engineer had answered with the kind of delighted thoroughness that smart adults deploy when a child asks them a genuinely good question. Eliza was 8 and had taken over the management of the chickens with an administrative efficiency that would have been impressive in an adult, had strong opinions about the naming of all ranch animals, and was teaching herself to read veterinary pamphlets from the agricultural extension, because she wanted to understand what she was working with. Will was 4, watchful and quiet and capable of absolute stillness outdoors, in the way of someone who is learning the land from the inside. Already the one most likely to be found sitting in the cottonwoods by the creek watching the water. Susanna was 33 years old and was running a ranch and a school and a household, and doing it with a quality of grounded assurance that was different from the careful composure she had worn in Missouri, different from the managed precision of someone managing too much alone. This was something earned and settled, the assurance of a woman who had built something real and knew it, who was in the place she had chosen and knew that too. Raymond was 42 and had in him the deep contentment of a man who has done the work and gotten the thing right. Not by luck, though luck had a part in it, all the small confluences that resulted in Mrs. Calloway's terrible apple cake and a letter from Mrs. Potts, and a word that was wrong, but by paying attention when it mattered, by recognizing what was real, by writing 4 days when 4 days needed writing. On a December evening at the end of that year, with the first real snow of the winter deep around the house and the fire high and the children in bed and Thomas and Priscilla quiet at their end of the house, Raymond and Susanna sat together in the front room with the lamp low and the fire warm, and Susanna had her head on his shoulder and his arm was around her, and there was a book open on his knee that neither of them was reading. "Raymond," she said. He said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. She was quiet for a moment with the fire and the snow outside and the deep settled quiet of the house. "I want to tell you that I am happier than I have ever been," she said. "Not just content, happy, genuinely, fully happy. I have the school and the children and this house and you and the mountains out there, and I chose all of it. I am somewhere I chose." A pause. "Do you remember the letter I wrote? the one where I said I had never been somewhere I chose. I remember, he said. I crossed it out, she said. I wasn't sure I should have written it, it felt too bare. I'm glad you left it, he said. I read it 40 times. She lifted her head to look at him. 40 times, at least. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had been seeing him clearly for 11 years and put her hand against his face. You are a very good man, she said, exactly as Clara had said it years ago, but different in every way with everything behind it. I have had good help, he said. She kissed him then in the firelight, with the snow deep outside and the children sleeping and the mountains somewhere in the dark beyond the windows, and it was warm and real and entirely theirs. This life they had built from letters and a word and 4 days of riding, and a yes said in amber October light by the side of a great river, in a place that was the beginning of everything. Outside the snow fell on the high Colorado plain. The mountains stood white and enormous in the dark. The creek ran under the ice in the cottonwoods. The cattle were settled in the winter pasture, and the horses in the stable and the school building waiting for Monday, when 20 children would come through the door with cold faces and warm voices, and the world would continue to be made, as it is always made, by the ordinary miraculous act of people choosing each other. Raymond Garrison held his wife by the fire in the house they had built and thought of nothing, except that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, which is the whole and entire point. In the years that followed, James became an engineer who built irrigation systems across the Colorado River basin and came home every Christmas with his wife and their 2 sons to the ranch that had made him. Eliza became a veterinarian at a time when women were not supposed to be veterinarians, and was told this repeatedly, and ignored it repeatedly, and built a practice in Canyon City that served the entire valley. Will took over the ranch with Thomas's son Aldo when the time came, the 2 of them a partnership as natural as breathing, and kept it going and growing through weather and markets and all the ordinary catastrophes of agricultural life. Clara's paintings hung in galleries in Chicago and New York, and one eventually in a museum in Denver in a room with a placard that said, Susanna Garrison, née Thatcher, my teacher and the most unforgettable person I ever knew, C. Thatcher, 1920. Raymond and Susanna grew old on the high plain with the mountains outside the window and the creek in the cottonwoods, and the school in the yard that had grown into a proper building, by 1900 with a full-time teacher and 60 students, and Susanna on the school board until she was 62. They had their arguments and their difficult seasons and the accumulated weight of hard years, and they had the firelight and the reading aloud and the evening walks and the particular deep ease of people who have known each other long enough that silence between them is the most comfortable thing in either of their lives. Raymond Garrison never once regretted riding 4 days. Susanna Thatcher never once regretted saying yes while the light was like that. And the word that had been wrong was wrong until the end, which is to say, forever, because there was never a moment, from the dry goods store in Hannibal to the last years on the Colorado plain, when Susanna Thatcher was forgettable. She was the most present person in every room she entered. She always had been. He had simply been the one who rode far enough to say so.